Questo va pure su YouTube, voi siete d'accordo? Va pure su YouTube, sul canale YouTube di ASTRIL, può andare, mi date il permesso? Va bene. È partita la registrazione, glielo dice adesso. Okay. Siamo pronti. I grafici che sono, diciamo, non stati mai pubblicati. Va bene. Sì, io mi metto al tuo posto. No, sì, perché questo mi sembra il posto migliore, quindi chi parla è meglio che sta qua. Sì, io mi metto prima al posto di Stefano, sì, e poi voi vi spostate, sì, ok, sì, vabbè, sì. Sì, va bene, ma sono piccole domande, non è niente svedese. Comunque siamo già su YouTube, quindi forse questi commenti sarebbe meglio evitarli. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the plenary session of our conference, and it focuses on the macroeconomic effects of inflation in the present European institutional context, how tackling inflation, economic stagnation, further social polarization, and the restructuring of value change and increasing private public debts are all themes that are at the center of current economic policy debates and dilemmas. I thank Dr. Stefano Neri of Bank of Italy, Francesco Saraceno of Sciences Po University, Roberto Tamborini of the University of Trento, and Pasquale Tridico, President of Inps, for accepting our invitation to discuss these issues. The scheduled time for each intervention is 20 minutes in order to have, at the end of all the presentation, 40 minutes for general discussion, questioning about the public and also between the participants to the panel. And so the first presentation is the one of Dr. Neri, entitled Energy Shocks, Inflation and Monetary Policy, to whom I give the floor, and now I put your leader.
Okay, so first of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and discuss about very important issues for all of us and our families. So the title of my presentation is Energy Shocks, Inflation and Monetary Policy. So the first couple of slides will be just a recollection of what happened in 2021 and 22 regarding commodity markets, gas and oil, basically. Then the second part will be about the move from a low inflation environment to a high inflation environment. This section will have some analytical content, some charts that are from internal analysis at the bank. And the last part will be pretty institutional, of course, and we'll just take stock of what has been done by the ECB and what are the current expectations about the next moves in terms of for example, policy rates. So this chart discusses developments in oil market. We know that gas prices are very clearly more important than oil prices, but there still is a sort of shock component also in the oil market. So on the left-hand side, you see the Brent oil prices and their volatility, and on the right-hand side chart, you see an indicator of demand and supply imbalance in the oil market. So basically in 2021, mainly due to the reopening of economies following the most acute phase of COVID pandemic, there was an increase in the demand for oil across the globe. There was also some substitution of natural gas, of oil with natural gas in China that played some role. All in all, basically, we moved from an environment with demand in which demand was below supply. You see the blue bars on the right-hand chart, to an environment in which supply was not coping with increasing demand due mainly to reopening. So those are the red bars on the right-hand side chart. Really, things got worse as Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, and around that period, oil prices reached $133 per barrel, which is a price that was not seen since mid-2008. Just to recall, at that time, inflation reached 4%. Now we are living in a period of inflation around 10%. And starting from fall last year, the price of oil has fallen to around $80 per barrel on concerns about the possible weakening of global demand, still ongoing, at that time, COVID-0 policy in China, and so on. But the main shock came from the gas market. Gas market that for many years was not seen as a problem at all. The price was hovering around $20 per megawatt hour, 20 euros per megawatt hours between, I say, 2011 and 2020. So no one cared actually about the price of gas, even in our internal modeling, because the main driver for inflation was oil prices rather than gas prices. But that has, happens sometimes, bad shocks occur. So there was a combination of factors that hit the market. Again, the demand for gas increased as economies reopened. There were also adverse weather conditions in certain parts, particularly of Europe. And again, also, as I said before, regarding oil, there was this substitution of coal with gas that was quite important in China, of course, within the idea of moving towards a greener economy. But then in the second half of 2021, there was tensions between Europe and Russia started, and over Nord Stream 2. But everything unfolded so rapidly after the invasion, and you know all where the price of gas went up to, around 110 euros per megawatt hour. But there was spikes also that reached much higher numbers. Now moving from the shocks to the market to the key variable of my presentation, the key theme, which is inflation. Let's put the current shocks into context. So if you look at the left-hand side chart, that's a measure of the difference between the energy component of the HICP. The HICP is the Consumer Price Index that is basically targeted by the ECB, okay, by its mandate. And the difference with respect to the HICP that exclude energy. So if you can see the spike in 2022, and you just compare it to 1970 and 80s. Okay, there the major driver was of course oil prices. We know all about the story. So, but in the current situation, the whole set of materials for producing energy reached extremely high levels. So gas and oil together. If you look at the right-hand side chart, you see how much fuels, gas, electricity, and all together contribute to current inflation. Again, inflation is around 10%, say, so 4 percentage points are due to energy prices. And if you can look at the blue area, that's almost not visible until just today. So that's the gas contribution, which is almost 1 percentage point. I mean, to the HICP, so the basket of consumption of services that we buy in our everyday life. So 1 percentage point is gas. So what do these shocks, which are unprecedented by in historical comparison, matter for inflation? Well, this chart tries to answer this question. So what is the contribution of energy prices, gas and oil, to current inflation? And this is the composition that is based on a vector autoregressive model, whose paper will be published soon by Banca Italia. And you can figure out the direct and indirect impact of energy on HICP inflation. So the red bars are the direct impact of energy. So this is the component of the index that is measuring the price of energy. And that matters a lot. You see almost 4 or 5 percentage points in 2022. And then there's also a component of core inflation, which measures the prices of services and goods, like restaurants or like cars, that is affected indirectly by the price of energy and in general. And there's also there's a food component that is also affected by the price of oil and gas. Fertilizers, for example, are a way by which oil affects energy, food prices. So all in all, basically in 2022, we estimate that more than 70% of inflation is due to the direct and indirect effects of the energy shocks. So the story is, it seems that it's more a supply side story than a demand side story, which is probably different from the US, where also because of a major unprecedented fiscal expansion, there was an increasing consumption of goods and services, and that is keeping, for example, core inflation pretty high in the US. So the story is a bit different, but probably they will get more similar looking forward. So here's another attempt to dig into the drivers of inflation. Again, this is in particular, the right-hand side chart is a composition of energy inflation, headline inflation, and headline inflation minus energy with a vector autoregressive model. Try to understand the role of aggregate supply. You can think of, for example, bottlenecks in global value chains, or energy shocks to the various measures of inflation. And you see the red bars are bigger in all the three cases, which again is consistent with the previous slide, in which supply side, in particular energy shocks, are still playing a major role in driving inflation to historical highs. So both type of analysis suggest that there's certainly a supply side component that is related to energy. I mean, gas is a very European story. It's not a matter for the US, for example, which are actually benefiting from gas crisis in Europe by selling liquefied natural gas to European countries. But gas is a major issue for us, because countries like Germany and Italy relied extensively on imports from Russia. And to some extent, I personally believe, and I have a paper on that the revision of the monetary policy strategy in 2021, with which the ECB clarified that the target for inflation is 2% and not something that is not clearly defined as it was before, below but close to 2%. That's a kind of magic number that no one knew what it was. Now it's 2%, and I think, based on my research, that also played a minor role in raising inflation, but not certainly to explain much enough to explain a 10% inflation. But it did play a minor role. Now, there's an important dimension in inflation, which has to do with the fact that households are heterogeneous in terms of consumption patterns, consumption expenditures. So households with low income, they typically spend much more on items such as, the petrol for the car and the food. You have to bring the kids to school and so on. So while people in the highest quintile of the income or expenditure distribution probably spend a much higher share on going to restaurants and going to cinemas or going on holiday compared to the lowest quintile. So these slides show basically what happens when you move to a high inflation environment. So you see, basically, these are based on ISTAT data, so they're publicly available. There's no econometrics in this. It's just plotting time series. You see basically that in December 22, for example, a month ago, inflation for the households in the first quintile of the expenditure distribution, okay, is those that has lowest expenditure, which is composed a lot by energy and food, as I said, was nearly 8 percentage points higher than in inflation, actually, felt by households in the top quintile of the consumption distribution, which is a lot, which is a big difference. So this basically shows that there's a massive redistribution or distribution effect of inflation that affects clearly the poorer households, which cannot compress consumption beyond a certain limit, because otherwise they wouldn't bring kids to school and they will not eat. So, kind of finish with the more analytical content, so to say. Then the question is, are we in a new environment compared to what was defined as the low inflation period, an inflation between 2013 and 20, in which inflation was basically stuck at below 1%. And we also, at some point, ran the risk of entering into a deflationary environment. But probably it's a bit too early to say. Although, it's kind of scaring if you look at the at the chart on the right. The blue line is the price level, so it's not inflation, it's the price level. And the red line is the price that you would have had if all items would have grown at 2% in all months, basically. So we went very below the 2% trend at some point in 2019. And it took very, very little time to move up above the red line. So that is because of inflation was very high. And we are in an environment probably that is very different from the 70s. I mean, for various reasons, central banks are now independent. They are more focused on their price stability mandate, but certainly there's no room for complacency. Now, I'll skip one slide and move to this one, which is probably more interesting for you. Where are we standing in terms of policy rates? Well, there has been 4 rate increases since July 2022, and you see here how expectations of analysts surveyed by the ECB have moved over time as the ECB raised policy rate. And now they're expecting another 50 basis points in February and 25 basis points in March. And probably, according to the latest survey in December, that would be the kind of terminal rate. I mean, the rate that would reach at the end of the tightening cycle. And as Philip Lane said just a couple of days ago, if you focus on the last bullet point, the policy rate, which is the rate on the deposit facility, the deposit that banks have at the Eurosystem, which is 2%, it's kind of in a neutral region. So with another 75 basis points that I described that are expected by markets, you would move into contractionary theory for the first time, I don't know, for how many years. And with this, I complete my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neri, for your very interesting presentation. You have rightly stressed that inflation has a very different impact on household classes, and more generally, I think that there is a problem concerning the impact of inflation on real wages. And also because we have a tendency by firm to translate the increase in the price of energy on prices to defend the profit margin. So at the level of central bank is often say that we must avoid a wage price spiral. And I agree with this, but one of the issues that we must discuss is how to avoid a strong reduction in the purchasing power of workers, so a strong reduction in real wages. So I think that this is one of the issues that we should discuss here during this plenary session. And so now I give the floor to Professor Tamborini. No, Professor Saraceno. We have said that we follow the alphabetical order. So, Professor Saraceno and his paper.
Dove messo?
With the villain, a very different lesson from the 1970s, and also from the title, I mean, you have a very different view.
Well, I'm not sure actually. Let's see. Well, thank you. And other policies. Thank you very much, Sergio. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, finally in presence. Let's say that. It's the first time I'm here in present. Yes, actually, I'm going to try to give you a sort of account of the state of the debate today on inflation, and I will argue that we are slave of a dead economist, as Keynes said famously, but this dead economist is not the one you would expect. This dead economist is Milton Friedman, and there is the current debate is quite strongly influenced by let's say the pillars of the old, not so old actually, monetarist thought. And I will, towards the end of my presentation, try to also give you an alternative view, and I will argue that one of the central bankers that has been more criticized in the history, which is Arthur Burns, the central bank, the Fed chairman during the 70s, actually had a quite modern view of the inflationary process that we should reassess and reevaluate. That's the explanation for the title. So what is the conventional narrative from the 70s? Well, there were supply shocks pretty much similar to the ones that Stefano so clearly described that happened in the past couple of years. These supply shocks were compounded by a number of policy errors, basically some sort of Pavlovian reflex of policymakers of the time that try to react to the increase of unemployment through fiscal and monetary expansion, thus creating the stagflation that we saw between the mid-70s and the early 1980s. That happened, that triggered a price-wage spiral that was due to the fact that expectations of inflation were revised upwards, and wages followed, among other things, because institutional features of the time were quite different from the ones we have today, and in many advanced countries, wages were indexed to the price level. And so at the time, the central banks that were not independent and were subjugated by the political process basically made the error or had not the choice of following the fiscal expansion, and that led to the phenomenon of too much money chasing for goods, and so of inflation. So at the time, that was the cover of Time magazine. At the time, the worst central banker in history was considered to be Arthur Burns as a sort of. So this is the conventional narrative. That conventional narrative is the one that we heard a lot during the discussion on the Great Moderation prior to the global financial crisis. We heard it a lot. Then it kind of disappeared during the long deflationary period that followed the global financial crisis. And of course, this narrative came back very strongly in the past couple of years, once inflation, as Stefano described so well, started resuming. What are the theoretical foundations of that narrative? Basically, it's the old monetarist theory. Okay, so and this monetarist theory is based on three elements. The first element is the quantity theory of money, with the very important corollary that both money demand and money supply are stable functions, and so they can be affected by central bank actions. The existence of an attractor for the economy, that is the natural employment, NAIRU, there's differences that it's not worth here mentioning. And last but not least, the Phillips curve that embeds expectations in the Friedman, I would say, version that embeds expectations and so shifts in the short run and ends up being vertical in the long run. If you take these three elements together, they yield the very famous monetarist statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So there is the only way you can control inflation is through a monetary policy, or the only way you can let inflation go, if you see it the other way, is by letting money supply go. Why do I say that Friedman is the dead economy that is still influencing us? Because these features of the monetarist theory, monetarist has been criticized very heavily since the very beginning. There were very interesting discussions by Tobin, by James Tobin, by Calder, and by many others. And so it seemed to be defeated from a theoretical point of view. But in fact, the main tenets of monetarism were eventually embedded in the consensus that emerged in the early 80s, the so-called new Keynesian models, or the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. Thank you very much, Sergio. Because these models embed the natural rate, embed the error correction, if you want, of the system. So the system tends to go back to the natural rate by itself. In the end, they embed a long-term vertical Phillips curve. So however more sophisticated they are than the old monetarist theory, these models carry on the main theoretical features of the monetarist theory, and hence the main policy implications. Monetary policy, as you know, in the DSG models, is only effective in the short run and mostly works through the anchoring of expectations. And so by making the environment for markets to work as smooth as possible. And whatever complication you introduce in that model, as it has been done, the literature on DSG is, of course, extremely rich, and there are a plethora of models that go back to that tradition. All of them share, nevertheless, this idea that you have an attractor for the economy. And so all of them, taken away all the complication, end up giving the same theoretical result and policy prescription. And so Friedman is the new Keynes, is the new dead economist that is affecting all of us. When we got when after COVID we started seeing prices increase, mostly, as was said before, because of the energy shocks. I will come back to that in a few seconds. Immediately, the old narrative came back very strongly in the press and among policy makers. There was an argument that demand was driving, even if the supply shock was at the source of the inflationary process, demand was also increasing. Mostly that was said for the United States, but some people argued that that was also true for the Eurozone. Labor markets were seen as being tightening, and so potentially giving upward pressure for wages. And finally, the risk of the anchoring of expectations was mentioned more and more often by participants to the debate. And so the conclusion of this type of argument was that regardless of the source of the shock, nobody questioned that the shock was a supply shock, of course. So it was very hard to question the number that were shown in the previous slide. But regardless of the nature of the shock, that was actually irrelevant. What was important is that shock risked triggering the anchoring of expectations and the wage price spiral. And that needed to be contrasted by a tightening of monetary policy. And the example of Paul Volcker and the disinflation of the early 80s was, of course, made more and more often. Of course, with that, it was also acknowledged that this inflationary process would come at a cost. It would come at the cost of inducing a more or less severe slowdown of the economy. it's quite interesting that the call for tightening came at the very beginning of the inflationary process, because the idea was precisely that a tightening of monetary policy was not going to directly affect prices, but simply affect expectations. So it needed to be done right away, even if at the time there was no demand side inflationary pressure. But there is, and it has been proposed by many, a very different story, of course. And this story is, the story I think is the right story, especially given what we saw in the previous presentation on the source of inflation. And this story is not an aggregate demand story. It's not a quantity of money story. It's not an aggregate inflation story. It's a story of sectoral micro imbalances between demand and supply. If you want, the trivial definition of inflation is inflation occurs every time there is an excess demand. The problem is that these excess demands are not global, but are sectoral. And so you can have some sectors in which you have excess demands. You can have some sectors in which you have excess supplies. And so in some sense, this trivial observation that excess demands lead to an increase in prices lead to a much less trivial, if you want, conclusion, which is that there needs to be an inflation rate for every market. And we need to consider the heterogeneity of inflation rates. This slide taken from, somebody's not happy with my presentation up there. This slide taken from Eurostat data basically shows the proportion, the ratio, the share of prices of sectors of goods for which prices had different inflation rates. So you see the yellow part is inflation rates above 4%. The gray part is between 2 and 4. The orange is 0 and between 0 and 2, and the blue part is goods for which the price went down. And as you can see, even at the height, if you want, of inflation in the past few months, you had around 5% of the goods that were experiencing deflation. That was also shown in the Istat numbers you showed before. There were some goods for which inflation was below 0, which are the goods that mostly are in the baskets of rich households, right? So there is a very strong heterogeneity of sectors, and that heterogeneity leads eventually to an aggregate inflation rate that embeds price going up and prices going down. I'm perfectly on time, I think. Maybe I was too. And so what happened? Once we have in mind that definition of inflation, a micro structural definition of inflation, not an aggregate definition of inflation, what happened then? Well, it happened that there was a reallocation of demand during COVID that already started happening during COVID. So even during COVID, there were some goods for which the prices were going up, while there were some goods for which you had the inflation. That demand reallocation is still here. We don't know whether it will be still be here in a few years. I just remind you that in 2020, people say that air travel would never be the same. Now we are above the pre-COVID levels of air travel in many countries. So you see, we don't know how much that change was permanent or temporary, but certainly it was a reshuffling of demand and hence of tensions on the productive capacity. That was compounded by, and that was also mentioned very quickly in the previous presentation, was compounded by a very unequal impact. The distributional component of inflation has come a lot in the current crisis, and that is very important to keep that discussion going. You also said in introduction you wanted this panel to give an answer. I'm not sure we will be able to, but certainly it's important to be discussed because COVID did not affect everybody in the same way. And paradoxically, for example, in the United States, we saw that COVID managed to reduce a little bit wage inequality because the sectors that were open were the food, distribution, et cetera, where you have lower skilled workers working. So the wages in these sectors actually increased relative to the others, and that was a short-lived phenomenon. But you see, there are very different and very complicated distributional features of this process. Then, at the end of the pandemic, when the pandemics was past the acute phase, a lot of the forced savings that were built during the first few months were put back on the market. Not all of them, but a good deal of them. And they were also put in the market in very different sectors. The fact that you didn't go to the restaurant for 3 months didn't mean that you went to the restaurant 5 times per day later. So some of the lost activity was never made up. And so this was also, once again, heterogeneous across sectors. And so you saw before that you had very different impacts on the price of different sectors and or goods. Last but not least, we had a number of global shocks. We started with the problems in the global value chains during COVID, and more importantly, during the recovery phase after COVID. You remember transportation, shipping. You remember all of the discussion on all the footage on the Shanghai ports completely paralyzed by containers and so on and so forth. To these bottlenecks, then on top of these bottlenecks came the energy crisis that started. That was also very clear from the slides in the previous presentation. Started before the war, and of course were amplified by the invasion of Ukraine, and these very unequal recovery, both of economic activity and of prices, of course, led in some sectors to very important increases in profits, and that is an important consequences from a distributional point of view. And I just put here a tweet that was quite interesting, especially for the discussion it triggered, by Olivier Blanchard, who said inflation is not always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's certainly always and everywhere a distributional phenomenon. It has the distributional consequences, and that I think was a quite interesting tweet. Especially this discussion that followed was that is one of the few interesting things that happened on Twitter lately. Okay, so let me test the conventional narrative I explained before. First, is it true that we had an aggregate problem of excess demand? I did the exercise, I performed the exercise that Stiglitz and Darkwater, I don't remember her name, sorry, and Regmi did for the United States for the Eurozone. I computed the 2014-2019 trend growth rate, and I checked for GDP, consumption, exports, and investment, whether they were above or below that trend. For the Eurozone, all of these 4 variables are today lower than they should have been had the economy kept growing at the same rate it had between 2014 and 2019. Of course, I didn't take the previous years, because the previous years were years of turmoil in the Eurozone. The same thing, so we don't have an aggregate demand problem in the Eurozone. That is quite clear from this very rough and very trivial exercise. And Stiglitz and Regmi do the same. Actually, I was inspired by their exercise. They do the same thing for the United States, and even for the United States, where there was a very important fiscal component of the recovery of the economy. Even for the United States, they don't find overwhelming evidence of an overheating of the economy. They notice that GDP investment are below the pre-2019 trend. The public expenditure is slightly above. Consumption is slightly above, exports are well below. So overall, even in the United States, aggregate demand is not as strong as one would have expected. Yes, but this is not a problem. We were said by the narrative. By the narrative, we were said the real problem is expectations. And so let me look, once again, we could take as many indicators of expectations as we want. We saw some in the previous presentation. And even that, we can see that it doesn't pose serious problem. You don't see the anchoring of expectation. Even in the months in which inflation was very high and seemingly out of control, and the ECB was accused of being too slow to react, expectations, long-term expectations of inflation were not the anchor. They of course increased a little bit, but not dramatically. So what is the lesson? Here is markets were perfectly conscious that these shocks were temporary, could be long-term temporary, but remain temporary shocks. And so you can see that even in the recent period, in the very recent last couple of months, these were taken from the ECB website that were updated last week. As you can see, that there is even a downtick in the very recent past. And what about prices? Once again, we saw some data from the previous presentation. I took this data from the ILO global wage report that came out a couple of weeks before Christmas. I am not being very nice with our president of the ECB by taking these quotes a little bit out of context. Of course, you always do that with quotes. But as you can see, the real wage went down everywhere. There is no country where that was not the case, including the United States, where there is a very sustained wage dynamics. I think Pasquale will discuss a little bit more wages and real wages, so I will pass on that. But you clearly don't see here the risk of a wage price spike, and that is during a year where inflation was on the rise. Now that we enter into a period where inflation by itself will go down for the reasons that were remembered before, we don't expect this spiral to happen. So the pillars of the conventional narrative on the 70s do not seem to be very much warranted. And let me add that monetary policy tightening does not come without costs. It does not come without, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It doesn't come without costs for the reason we all know. It triggers a slowdown of the economy. We will enter into recession. We don't know. Yes, no, probabilities change all the time. Maybe we will avoid a recession. Certainly, we will not avoid a slowdown of the economy. So that is for sure. But there are more subtle ways in which monetary policy tightening may be a problem, precisely because of the nature of the inflationary process. This is just Larry Summers with a background ill-chosen, saying that we need to suffer in order to curb inflation. We should have thought twice where to take this interview. The interest rate increase can actually become a problem to solve the supply side problems we saw. First, of course, an increase in interest rates will lower investment. And investment is one of the keys, both public and private, is one of the keys to solving these bottlenecks I was mentioning before. Second, an increase in the interest rates can lead to an increase in markups in non-competitive markets. And that is a very old and very interesting result of a paper by Phelps and Winther. If you want, it's a search model. It's an ante litteram search model in which you can show that basically if the interest rate increases, the risk of losing customers in the future is less important, and so firms increase their markup if they can. And on top of that, the tightening, of course, will have a differentiating impact. Once again, the distributional feature of this process come to the fore. Okay, and let's not forget, now that inflation is going down, that this is not the making of monetary policy. The literature is overwhelmingly in agreement on the fact that the impact of monetary policy is felt between 12 and 18 months from the beginning of tightening. Even if expectations are very responsive, still you cannot think that the current decrease in inflation is the making of central banks. Central banks will not take credit. People will give central banks credit for that. We need to remember that this is not going to be the case. So let's go back to Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns was, as I said, very modern. That will be my last slide, even if I have a couple more, but it's not very important. Arthur Burns said when he was fighting with Nixon and with Congress over monetary policy, say that monetary policy could not work alone. And it reminds me of a certain Mario Draghi when in 2014 he said monetary policy cannot work alone. We need to go back to the policy mix. That was the point that Arthur Burns was making at the time. And he said monetary policy cannot work alone because inflation is structural, because inflation is sectoral, because inflation is supply side. And so we need and go if you want, sector by sector to try to tackle these bottlenecks. And you have plenty, I mean, I will not go over the list because I ran out of time. You have plenty of ways in which fiscal industrial policy can work together or instead of monetary policy to try to solve the sectoral bottlenecks. They go from industrial policy, from investment in specific sectors, from regulation, price controls, et cetera. Joe Stiglitz, in the paper I mentioned before, even goes to the point of saying that the United States should invoke the Defense Production Act, which is basically an act that allows the American government to expropriate private businesses to take the semiconductors away from the phone industry and put them into the car industry. Say it's more important that we keep going the car industry than people change telephone every 6 months. And so you can imagine a number of non-monetary solutions to the inflation problem. On top of that, and I will not go into details, the real question we have to ask is whether the secular stagnation that was a hot topic for the period 2014-2019 is really out of the picture. I leave that for the discussion. I'm not sure that this inflation episode will change the underlying long-term forces that push the world economy towards secular stagnation. So we might be actually having a big discussion about something that will disappear by itself in the near future, medium future. Sorry for being a bit long.
Really, thanks to Professor Saraceno. Of course, I am very sympathetic on some points of your presentation, especially on your criticism on the idea of a benchmark natural rate of interest and the need of industrial, fiscal, and income policies in order to take inflation together with the monetary policy. Perhaps, and this is a point that we will find in the presentation by Tamborini. I think that in the decision by the European Central Bank about the interest rate, there is also another point. Not only the need to maintain price expectation anchored, but also a problem with the exchange rate. So the relationship with the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve in particular. And I find really interesting your hint about the effect of the rate of interest on the markup. Perhaps I interpret this link between the rate of interest and the markup in a different way from you. Only a point. The problem is perhaps the real long-term interest rate that can affect the profit margin of the firms. And so we must also see what happens not only to the short-term interest rate in real and nominal terms, but also to the long-term interest rate. And so now we have the presentation by Professor Tamborini of University of Trento, entitled, now I have written it, Tackling Global Inflation at a Time of Radical Uncertainty. Luigi, ti hanno ballato qualcosa? Ah, ecco fatto. Control L. I più giovani, the younger. Perfetto, meglio.
Okay.
We are ready to go. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and for you to be present here. I have to say that my presentation draws on a paper co-authored with Luigi Bonatti and Andrea Fracasso that we presented at last November's Monetary Dialogue of the European Parliament with the ECB. And my focus will be on the global dimension of this experience of inflation we are doing now, and I will stress a little bit questions relating to coordination across the Atlantic, basically. And this will help me to diversify a little bit, which is very difficult with respect to the previous excellent presentations. You will judge whether there has some agreement or disagreement, mostly agreement, I would say, but it's up to you. Radical uncertainty. I think it's no need to spend time to remember in this room that radical uncertainty is a term that has a history and basically is related to Knight and later Keynes. And this is just the extremely well-known sentence about Keynes about radical uncertainty. What strikes me, and that's why we put it in the forward of the paper, is how timely it sounds now. It's mentioning whether in terms of radical uncertainty, we simply don't know, but now unfortunately we know that there has been a war, and who knows what the price of the copper will be in 30 years or what the interest rate will be in 30 years. So it's extremely timely, and that's just to remember the extremely challenging scenario in which we are living. I choose to start with three stylized facts that basically have already been done. So this is thanks to the previous presenter, so I will be very quick. The first is that in the second half of 2021, we have been witnessing a steep escalation of prices worldwide, but the boost of inflation has mostly come from energy, then food, but now that we have a second, third round effects involving other items. These are this is a chart taken from the IMF World Economic Outlook, but Stefano Neri has already presented all the fundamental information about this. The second stylized fact is that to some extent, for the reasons that Francesco has reminded, then not simultaneously, but more or less in line, central banks are rising interest rate, though, as the IMF has stressed, this was until last December, actually real policy rates and even long-term real rates are not yet strongly in negative territory. So it's a mild reaction to the present situation. Nonetheless, there is a large consensus across various institutions that we are probably on the verge of a global slowdown and in some places recession. This is just a reminder of the IMF World Economic Outlook projections last October, and all are pointing down. And in particular, if you look at the blue line, euro area is pointing definitely downwards. And that's an interesting point on which perhaps we can discuss. I shall be very brief on one point. There is something going on which is not in terms of stagflation, which is not yet related primarily with restrictive monetary policy. This graph gives perhaps a more visual idea of what's going on. You know, the blue cloud, almost horizontal, is the relationship between inflation and output across the pandemic years. The red cloud is the inflation output relationship in the euro area in the last year. And you see there is a dramatic steepening of the situation, which gives you an idea of what's going on. GDP is slowing down, inflation is escalating, but this is not yet, as stated before, clearly due to monetary restriction. There is an endogenous stagflation, a point on which I will return later. So this scenario is extremely challenging because it's plagued by a lot of uncertainty about even medium-term developments. What we have done in the paper is to provide a map of the various possible causes underlying this inflation spike, both on the demand and the supply side. But as I said, I will try to focus more on the global dimension and the kind of coordination problem that this new scenario poses for monetary policy. This is just a teaching picture to remind the possible combination of aggregate demand and supply shocks that may impinge upon inflation. And just to add some complications to the picture, more or less you can find evidence of any of these things happening together. So it's really complicated from the analytical point of view. What the aggregate demand factors that have been detected, or maybe somebody stresses them, faster than expected post-pandemic rebound for large, though not all, part of goods and services, perhaps too prolonged or too strong monetary and fiscal stimuli, but on the supply side factor, longer than expected constraints on global supply chains and transports, persistent shortage and rising prices of rare raw materials, intermediate inputs, and agri-food, pressure on supply and prices of energy due to fast global recovery, geostrategic supply price, weaponization of energy prices, disruption of pipelines, Russian-Ukraine war, and tightening labor market condition and rising pressure for wage realignment, but not everywhere. So there is a number of clear symptoms that, as Francesco stressed, there is a lot of sectoral adjustment, sectoral shifts going on. There is some consensus view that aggregate demand factors are prevalent in US and UK and other advanced economies. Francesco said on the doubtful side of this evidence, aggregate supply factors are prevalent in the euro area with stronger threats of stagflation. And that's the picture. Let me stress what are the implications when we face imported cost factors of inflations, which means structural factors, and changes in relative prices are underway. And let me say, Francesco stressed the orthodox view that this, no matter what happens, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. But you can find a lot of conventional wisdom asserting that monetary policy faces serious limits and challenges when these kind of sectoral structural problems are happening, especially if they tend to be permanent. If there is a permanent change in relative prices, energy versus other inputs, of course, it's not a matter of a monetary policy. So I just focus on 2 points that should be considered and that set serious limits to monetary policy as a single game in town to fight inflation. One is endogenous stagflation, because through various channels, the inflation shock generates a contraction of aggregate demand and output independently of monetary policy. You find a lot of evidence of this. I mentioned some before. This is what exactly we are witnessing in these days. People complain about one of these channels, which is, as you said, the real income shock. Prices rise faster than wages, and then you have a real income effect. I don't want to go into this, but let me advertise a little bit. We have been working further on this. We try to simulate a standard new Keynesian model with a real income channel of surprise inflation, which is not in the standard model. And what you get is that actually you have a reaction of inflation, which is the red line on the left-hand picture, and a contraction through the real income effects in households' budgets. And this is even with neutral monetary policy, which is that the interest rate gap is zero. If you had a contractionary monetary policy of course, what you have lower inflation gap. You reduce the inflation gap per quarter, and which is the red line on the right-hand side, at the cost of a larger output gap. And so this perhaps gives an idea of what Schnabel, the German economist in the ECB board, said that central banks are facing a higher sacrifice ratio if they want to intervene in this scenario in which stagflation is already in place through endogenous channels. Of course, you have a high sacrifice ratio. You see how large is the output gap with the cost of a larger output gap vis-a-vis the gain of a lower inflation gap. The second point, which is more on the focus of the paper and my talk in this last part, is there is a number of coordination failures which may take place. The more inflation is a global phenomenon, the lower is the grip of monetary policy in any country as it's on its domestic inflation, which perhaps is in a further argument stressing the limits of monetary policy in this kind of environment. And three classic problems arise. The first is the small country crux, which means that no matter how severe the domestic contraction and the cut of energy imports, the impact on the global market is negligible and imported inflation remains high. So if you are small, you can make a very hard contraction, but of course the prices on the global markets do not react. The second, therefore, is the free ride temptation. Wait and let other larger global actors bear the burden of domestic contraction large enough to tame energy prices for all. But then, of course, there is a free ride problem, and perhaps nobody is willing to intervene. And the third one, which is relevant, as I shall say in a moment, especially for euro area, is the elephant in the boat. Given the dollar's centrality in the global financial system, the current US monetary tightening is causing serious spillovers on other countries, exporting inflation. Okay, if the dollar, if the euro devaluates with respect to the dollar, we import inflation, only partly mitigated by some gains in competitiveness. So since there are these clear textbook motivation, we can ask ourselves if there is a case for policy coordination. And what we stress is that yes, there is a case for coordination in two senses, which makes the thing even more complicated, because there is room, perhaps justification for monetary fiscal coordination, in a sense that Francesco has already pointed out. But also there is theoretically a case for international coordination. So you have a 2 × 2 matrix, which is quite complicated. Monetary fiscal coordination may help. And this is, I think, rather uncontroversial. Almost all official documents I read end up saying, once again, we cannot do it ourselves, only with monetary policy. The way in which fiscal policy may be helpful, even without going into the sectoral details that Francesco pointed out, is because more generally fiscal policy may be much more targeted. Since we have a sectoral problem, fiscal policy is more targetable, whereas monetary policy works on a general spectrum, which is not perhaps the best possibility. This, however, in the euro area raises the well-known problem of fiscal space. Fiscal space is not extremely large for everybody. Therefore, monetary policy should take financial stability into account, and in the euro area, some central fiscal capacity should be made available if we agree that there should be some coordination. Finally, the question about international policy coordination. You know that the call for coordination, no matter how strong are the theoretical motivations, is recurrent in history, but only few occasions we saw that it worked, or that countries explicitly agreed on a plan of action and respected. That's the real problem. And on this point of view, let me stress that there are asymmetric incentives between US and euro area. One is that the two parties are facing different kinds of inflation. There may be discussion about this, but I think that there is some grip of this argument. And we know, in practice from history, that the US authorities have incentives to internalize only to the extent that financial instability arising abroad may have negative consequences for the US itself. So what is more likely, just to make use of some game theoretic jargon, the US can act as leader and decide its moves on the basis of the state of the US economy, while the other countries cannot but adapt their policy to what the US is doing. So it's Zuckerberg kind of environment. So if the situation persists, we think that transatlantic negative spillovers may be expected to remain important, and this may be a driver for a tighter policy for the euro area, which is not, however, the optimal solution. To conclude, central banks have to tackle inflation at a time of radical uncertainty about causes, persistence, transmission mechanisms, collateral effects, worldwide connections, and spillovers, and limited control over several of these factors. Just to connect to the points raised by Francesco, so their credibility is a key factor of success. I think that's a good point. But credibility has two meanings. One is doing what has been promised, and this is what you find in the literature. The other is promising what can be done. I mean, credibility means both things. So understanding and communicating the limits that monetary policy can encounter and how these limits are addressed in the policy strategy is as important as the determination to tame inflation. You know, for central bankers to be preserved from the damnation of omnipotence. If you believe, or people is made to believe that you are omnipotent, of course, if you fail, you are dead. But inflation is not always and everywhere only a monetary phenomenon, especially today. So central bankers, to preserve credibility, should first make clear that they are not omnipotent in this kind of environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tamborini. And as you are seeing, we are introducing other issues. For instance, the need of fiscal space. And we know that the different countries of the Eurozone have different fiscal policies, so you should need some central fiscal space, and so a need to some reform of the institutional setting of the European Union. And this is very important, because if different countries have different fiscal space, of course, the coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy that you emphasize in the final part of your presentation for different countries can work as for other countries. The situation is very different from Germany and for Italy in this respect. We have now the last presentation by Professor Tridico, who I really thank to be here, knowing his several tasks and engagement as president of Inps. And the title of his intervention is Medium-Term Perspective for the Italian Economy.
Okay, thank you, Sergio, for the invitation. It's always yeah, more or less. Well, actually, I never gave you that title. You invented that title. You presumed that I
did not send me the title.
Yeah, that's true.
Put something on the floor.
That is true, and I'm really sorry about that. I apologize. But as far as, well, I got the opportunity to speak about that, and then I started to read, and again, to wonderful things, which I usually read in my previous life. In particular, during these days, as you know, the debate was quite lively since some economists, worldwide known, were raising the issue of this title, basically, Blanchard, Stiglitz, Krugman, and then it was as well recalled on the blog by Lavoie, and the issue of inflation not as a monetary phenomenon was recalled, and they were found some convergences with post-Keynesian analysis, which I would like now to put forward as some reflection. Let's start from some evidences. I was really curious to go to see some old textbook issues with inflation and unemployment, showing the tendency that you can see here now in Europe, in states between 2018 and 2022, quarterly data, and similar data you would see in Spain and in Italy between 2018 and 2022, quarterly data, as well as in France and in Germany, less in Japan and more in UK. So then what is inflation? Traditionally, in Nairo analysis, you will see the excess of aggregate demand, the increasing of trade union power, the increasing in employment, and in wages, and inflation, which is driven by the wage price spiral. Well, today I don't think this is exactly the case. Yeah? You don't see an increase in trade union power. You wouldn't see so much increase in Italy. Don't see at all increase in employment or in wages. Today I was at trade union and government table speaking about issue linked to pensions, and you will see basically that there is no issue of increasing power in trade union that you don't see, at least. And even the wage issue is not even at stake in the debate. It is quite strange to see, for instance, that as far as pensions are concerned, you will see an increasing pension. There is an indexation in pension. From 1st January 2023, pensions were increased by 23 billion euros in Italy, 23 billion euros in Italy, and wages were not increasing. We are actually experiencing a not equilibrium between an increasing in pension and not increasing in wages, which is critical for the sustainability of pension system as well. And nobody seems to care about that. And of course, this is an issue linked to the indexation, which applies to some extent to pension and does not apply to wages at all. So I would basically speak about a variation in the Nairo analysis, similar as well in the conclusion that you recalled, Francesco, coming of course from the heritage of COVID and the temporary shortages which were creating in the semiconductor industry in particular, and then of course after the war in Ukraine with the energy crisis, the increase in energy sector and the increase in prices, but only in prices. So we see here a price factor inflation and not a price factor and not a price wage spiral, as we were even used in the Nairo analysis when the excess of demand was at stake. So here you see a price factor with stagnating wages. You were showing the data in the last years of monetary wage, and the a clear increase of markup. We are speaking about imperfect competition. We are speaking about clearly sectors where you have monopolistic competition or basically not perfect competition, imperfect competition. The markup increases, price increases, monetary wages are stagnant, and real wage basically decrease. So let me show you now a sort of variation of this textbook Nairo analysis, where basically profit, the M coefficient which multiply productivity, the M is expanding and eroding basically real wages, because the price real wage curve is going down, but traditionally we are used to see the bargaining real wage which is increasing inclined. I would say, and then basically the unemployment is decreasing. But I think that now we are observing a situation where the BRV, basically the bargained real wage, is a sort of vertical curve, at least in the first phase, where you see the the line which is not continuous, the other line, the vertical line, basically in the first phase is the bargaining real wage, and then eventually the bargaining real wage take the shape that we know, which is increasing. So what does it mean then that the bargaining real wages vertical in the first phase. Basically, it means that inflation increases, price increases, and real wage decreases. Unemployment does not change. Basically, employment remains the same. And the NAIRO, which we are used to see as a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, become basically a rate at which trade unions don't ask increases of wages. In this sense, you really see inflation as a conflict distributive phenomenon rather than a monetary issue. Here does not really matter the money supply. What really matters is where the per capita product goes. With this dynamics, basically you just see an expansion of the M coefficient, and all the other factors are remaining constant. So then, the NAIRO is the rate at which trade unions don't ask wages and don't get employment, and that's it. Now let's introduce in this picture, of course, as well the state. The state is part of the dynamics as far as tax wage is concerned, and as far as industrial policy are not concerned. As far as taxation of profit are concerned, and as far as price control are not concerned. Actually, we are exactly in this situation today. I would say in Italy, but as well in other European countries. We are worrying about the possibility to tax profit when price already increases. But we are not controlling prices before they increases. Basically, we are not making a fight against inflation, but we are basically taxing profit. Eventually, we are not even succeeding in taxing profit, but we try to tax profit when inflation already increases. What we need to do instead would be to avoid that price increases, controlling prices before they increases. As far as we know that price increases from the energy sector to other productive sectors, we can control prices rather than tax profit after. Of course, we can use income policies as well. We in the past, we do have a tradition of, let's say, having in mind a tripartite agreement between trade union, businesses, and government. And theoretically, the idea is it sounds good. Instead of controlling inflation through restriction in money supply, you basically increases purchasing power of dependent worker through income policy, sustaining income, fighting against poverty, and giving goods and services in kind to worker and to dependent workers. So theoretically, this works, theoretically. As far as this tripartite agreement would be coupled with industrial policies which push firms to invest in capital-intensive strategy investment. And we do have, as I said, experiences of this did not happen. Well, was designed to happen in the 90s, and instead did not happen in the way the policymaker would wish. So basically, we can use income. Yeah, I'm going to conclude. We can use income policies. We can use tripartite agreement. But this time, tripartite agreement are not going to moderate wages, because actually wages are already moderated. They are going to moderate prices, because they are the factor which is increasing. So the tripartite agreement is the alternative to monetary policy and to increases of interest rate, which causes recessions, as far as price control are in place. So the model that we could have in mind, again, starting from the Nairo analysis and changing the BRV, as I said, having a BRV which is vertical for the first phases and increasing in the second phases, you could have the tripartite agreement, but with controlling prices rather than controlling wages in this phase. Capping prices in the energy sector and regulating, for the first time, we're not speaking about labor flexibility. As you would remember, when we were going to control inflation 20 years ago, 30 years ago, basically, the idea behind the structural adjustment, the idea behind the structural reforms was always to have in mind rigidity in the labor market, which should then be liberalized. So today, the labor market is not at the stake as being the market which causes problems because of rigidity, rather than the energy sector, the other sector closer to it, which are not, which are characterized by imperfect competition, monopolistic competition. So then they need to be regulated in the way of being more liberalized in order to cap the markup. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pasquale. On some more analytical point, we will discuss perhaps another time. I can imagine an horizontal first part of the BRW line, but not a vertical one. So, but at any rate, we will discuss about it because in other occasions. Really, thanks for your presentation. I have not understood if you are suggesting to introduce wage indexation as something that you find also for pension. Perhaps Visco would not agree with you because I listened him some times ago, and this is one thing that he would like to avoid for Italy. Is one of the points he stressed in his intervention, but of course it's one point that could be that should be discussed, because as you have said, we have a problem of distribution, we have an increase of the profit margins in some sectors, we have a problem for the real wages, and so this is one issue, how we can defend real wages in this situation. So we can open the discussion, and first of all, I think if there are questions from the audience, not too much questions, yes, because we have too much time. And then we give 4 or 5 minutes for the answers. There are questions? Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. I actually have 2 questions. The first one goes to Mr. Neri. I found your presentation about inflation very interesting and about core inflation. What I would like to ask you is about price rigidities. It's an effect that, has it materialized, the effect of energy inflation, has it materialized to the services and other sectors? And what is the role of price rigidities will play now that energy inflation eases? And my second question goes to Professor Tamborini, and of course, international coordination has failed, or we can admit on that, but what about fiscal and monetary coordination. President Lagarde always mentions that fiscal policy should be targeted, tailored, and temporary, and most people say that it's not targeted at all. So I would like to ask about the prospects of the fiscal and monetary coordination, especially now that we're going into quantitative tightening and increasing interest rates. Thank you.
Okay. Here.
Good afternoon. So my question is probably more concerned the second presentation or the third, but it's open to everybody. Do you see any issue of long interest rate environment prolonged, let's say, forever? Because unless of demand shocks, no, let's say demand push inflation, no. So the central banks will never actually increases, no, the interest rates. This will mean staying forever on a low interest rate environment. And I don't know if this could have been a reason for an exit strategy somehow also for the central banks to return to some what could be considered normal rates such as 2, 3, 4%. Thank you.
Other question?
My question is open to everybody. So, and it relates to debt management. We've understood that inflation management is a very complex issue, obviously, for all the reasons we've heard. Do you think that inflation management poses a problem for debt management? And in particular, do you think that it should be different? We should diversify between public debt management and private debt management, because government typically like, or some say that governments like inflation because it squeezes public debt, because they typically can adjust to it. The nominal values of debt doesn't change, but income and taxes do typically adjust to inflation. Ceteris paribus, obviously, if there's a recession, obviously tax revenues can go down as well. But if nothing happens, normally taxes would go up, and government revenues goes up, and that squeezes debt. So, and we all see that normally debt to GDP ratio tends to go down, or the forecasts are adjusted downwards. So debt is good for public debt. Inflation is good for public debt. I'm not sure the same can be said for private debt. So my question for you is, what are your views in terms of what inflation implies for public debt in general, making the difference between public debt and private debt? Because obviously debt servicing costs for private households are very different.
Thank you, Massimo. I think that here there is a problem also related to the different fiscal space for the different Eurozone countries, because, the rise in the interest rate has also in the respect of the public debt a different impact. Perhaps we have space for only another question, if there is somebody? Yes, okay, thank you.
Most of you, in fact, have looked at inflation as a problem of redistribution, but you didn't name one huge redistribution which is happening, and this is due to the large gap between inflation rate and interest rate. I refer to savings. So savings are losing value. This should be also a source of concern.
Thank you, Andrea. And so, I mean that you can have 3-4 minutes. Okay, and perhaps we can follow the same order. Okay.
Okay, so I'll start. I'd like to just touch on two issues that have come up during the presentations, but also during the Q&A session. So the first is about sectoral developments and energy price developments, the fact that they are falling, and all the things, the pass-through of energy to services that was some mention at some point. So there's certainly a sectoral dimension in inflation. That is true. I mean, you know, we spent a lot of money on goods during the pandemic, and we were spending much more on services, going to restaurants, traveling, and so, you know, there's certainly a rebalancing in our expenditure pattern. But the pressures that are coming from the supply side, to a large extent, as I argued, and also from the demand side, are certainly becoming more broad-based. I think I have a chart, but also I think Francesco has a chart on that. So the number of items that are growing at higher inflation rates is certainly increasing. So the pressures are becoming more broad-based, exactly because the initial trigger, the shock, is feeding into the price of goods, of food, of services. In the end, it gets into the core components, which, remember, they are always the stickier ones. So they are the last one to adjust upward and the last to adjust downward, okay? And then the second point is about secular stagnation, which is something that I kind of like it. I think there's truth in it. There's a secular downward trend in interest rates. There are many explanations for that. I worked on aging and the impact of interest rates, and I think aging is going to be there. And so I don't see that the factor that driven in interest rates downward in the last 30 years. Remember, probably the 70s and 80s in terms of real rates were an exception. Some will argue that those are exceptional years from the point of view of real interest rate, because of probably mistakes also for central banks. But so I think the pressures on real interest rates from secular drivers are still there. And the only way to reverse that is to have a major technological breakthrough in really kind of game changer for the whole society, because the demographic pressures are inevitably getting worse as time passes. And that's it. I just want to touch upon this too.
You can use this. I mean, it's better.
Okay, I'll continue on secular stagnation. I've also been a big fan of secular stagnation in the past few years. My last slide, on which I didn't have time to comment, asked the question on whether we will go back to this type of problems once this very exceptional phase given by COVID and what happened since will subside. And I don't know. I tend to agree with Stefano that the secular forces that explained the chronic structural excess savings are still there. There are some forces that push in the other directions. For example, the ecological transition will certainly mean that the price of energy will never go back to the prices we had before. So there are some forces that might take us outside of this environment of very low inflation rates and very low interest rates. 2 or 3 years ago, I would have certainly said that secular stagnation was here to stay. Now I would say it's probably going to stay, but I mean, I revised a little bit downwards my probability. No, overall, I agree with you. And this actually, let me add one consideration. This, as it happened before COVID, poses the question of whether we should revise the central bank objectives. And most notably, as you know, there have been a few economists who have been arguing for higher inflation targets, pros and cons. These higher inflation targets would allow to have lower real interest rates, and so getting closer to the natural interest rate, which is a concept I don't like, but it's useful as to explain. And also higher inflation targets would also allow, this was in an old paper by George Akerlof, would also allow easier readjustment of relative prices that will certainly happen through the structural changes we are going to experience in the next few years. And so that is a discussion that I think is worth having. Once again, I don't have a very clear opinion on that, but my sense is that that there are some arguments in favor of this, of having an inflation target of 3–4% or something like that. On debt policy, on debt, fiscal monetary policy mix, let me clarify one thing. This is not a case, I mean, I made the case that we are not experiencing a strong demand, excess demand globally. Likewise, we are not experiencing a strong demand deficiency. So when the case is made for fiscal policy, that does not mean at an aggregate level necessarily increasing public deficits. That is something important, a reallocation of expenditure across sectors, a sustain of incomes, for example, through increased taxation on high incomes or on windfall profits. These are all options that the scope of fiscal policy in this case would not be to sustain aggregate demand. The scope of fiscal policy would be to remove the bottlenecks. And so we might not face this problem of an increase in debt in this current situation, even if we use actively fiscal policy. Yeah? That is something that's important. And the fact that inflation is up, of course, is a sort of present for government. Some have been arguing, I don't believe so. I think that the problem was more in trying to understand what to do following the Fed, but some have been arguing that one of the reasons why the ECB did not intervene as early as the Fed was precisely because having some inflation would kind of release the pressure on some other countries. As for private debt, you're right. On private debt, the idea that inflation washes away debt is much more problematic. I totally agree with you. This is a much more controversial issue. I would stop here.
Okay. Thank you. So let me start from your question about fiscal monetary coordination, which is, of course, more difficult to do than to say, especially in the euro area. Also because, let me stress once again that we should try to look at the global scenario. So I mentioned a 2x2 matrix, so monetary, fiscal, and across. Think, for instance, for the huge fiscal stimulus that the United States engineered at the end of 2021, and of course, it was a spillover on the global markets. And the fact whether I mentioned one reason that fiscal policy can be synergic with monetary policy in the sense that, and partly was also points that Pasquale Tridico raised, it can help to mitigate the effect of inflation and lessen the pressure on wage catching up through various measures that are much more targeted than monetary policy. The example is the fiscal support to energy bills that is used everywhere in Europe. Then there is the problem that you mentioned, whether these interventions are permanent or transitory, whether they create too much fuel, additional demand with respect to inflation. But let me stress another point that is important in view of the monetary and fiscal coordination, which stresses the difficulty, but also the necessity, and has to do with the long-term effect, exactly because we are facing an energy shock. Now, think of this example that is quite common in Europe. The governments are paying our energy bills. That's, in the short run, is synergic with monetary policy for the reasons that I mentioned before. But at the same time, you are contrasting, you are creating an obstacle to the substitution in the long term of high cost and non-renewable resources with respect to the fact that they have perhaps having a higher price would help adjustment and transition. But of course, this cannot be done by monetary policy. It has little to do with that. So combining the short run support to containment of inflation and wage pressures, and the long-run transition towards new energies, new energy sources, is an example of the complexity of the coordination between the two, but also of its necessity. We cannot perhaps address meaningfully this kind of situation without thinking of both leverages together. Low interest rate forever and normalization. Yes, I think that in fact there was also the need to try to normalize the situation, but this then relates to the issue of secular stagnation. The natural rate of interest is a very controversial notion, and I know all the theoretical problems that should be taken seriously, but let me give you a slightly tolerably Keynesian view of the natural rate of interest. Suppose, is there an interest rate somewhere such that enough investment is created to keep demand aligned with potential output? Okay? It's nothing written in the stone, but we can look around at it. Is it going down, this shadow interest rate? Is it rising? I think that the reason that I've mentioned, because probably there is no sharp break in the tendency to have this kind of reference interest rate higher than before, are still there. There are many reasons why the expected return to investment, to create enough investment to keep demand aligned with potential output, is still low, I think. And so normalization, I think, was in the order of things, but in the long run, when all this mess about energy shocks finish, whether or not energy prices will return in relative terms to the level that were before, or they signal a sharp need of a structural readjustment of production, it's really complicated. So I don't know, but of course, I think that some normalization was in the order of things. So this moment of realignment a little bit with the towards the upper bound is welcome, and because perhaps it creates rooms for perhaps the need in case of cutting down again the interest rate is needed. Finally, of course, debt, inflation, debt, and savings. Of course, inflation, like monetary policy, do have distributional effects. Whether you like or not, whether it fits with your theory or not, is a matter of fact. Inflation redistributes across capital and labor, and more importantly, I think, redistributes between debtors and creditors. That's the basic idea, right? And deflation does the opposite. And of course, monetary policy, to the extent that intervenes or not intervenes, plays a role within this mechanism of those who gains and who lose from inflation or deflation. This, by the way, gives me the opportunity to remember another important, very important missing ring in standard analysis, the fact that monetary policy has supply side effects. You can find literature of all kinds in the past and in the far past, in the more recent past, that stress that we should consider supply side effects of monetary policy. You mentioned Phelps Winter. There are Greenwald-Stiglitz channel of the interest rate on solvency of firms, and then you have a displacement of aggregate supply. There are even totally standard micro-founded arguments that through wealth effects, monetary policy has supply side effects. So this has completely disappeared, but I think we should consider, and so it could also be the case that in the present we have joint movements of demand and supply together, also through these channels. Of course, the inflation may help sustaining public debt for the reasons that we know. It's true that it's more complicated for the private sector because the private sector cannot create its own means of payment, unlike the public sector. And so it's more complicated. But generally, of course, there is a distribution with inflation out of creditors to debtors. That should be considered.
Okay, so let me brief and sharp. I will say, first of all, yes, a sort of indexation you would need today. Even if this is, let's say, linked to the level of wages, as we do in pension, yeah? You increase pension as far as they are low, and then you increase lower for a higher pension. So in order to create the equilibrium between the labor market and the pension system, you need to have at least for this generation the same level of increasing. So I would a sort of indexation proportional to the same increase of the pension would be necessary. Second, we live in a chronic situation of excess of saving. The fact that I will say the current inflation is not a monetary, is not originated in monetary, is not a monetary phenomenon, again, would be easily testified by the fact that you do have an excess of saving. Saving in the last years even increased. So you are not in front of an excess of the demand. You are rather in the opposite situation, with some problem in specific sector, typically the energy sector, not only the energy sector, with markup and profit increasing very much in those sector. That's it. Io non questo è la price of wage, no? Il salario determinato dal prezzo. Tu stai abbassando, perché oggi il invece sta abbassando. E l'esempio